Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fond du Lac Area Women's Fund's virtual series, Project Table Talk. I'm Maria Turner, the Executive Director here at the Women's Fund, and I'm joined today by co-facilitators Erin Flood and Kyle Jefferson, who are two members of our Board of Directors. We also welcome today our guests from the Fond du Lac County Child Protective Services, Metty-Reinhard and Erika Winterfeldt. Today, in the month of April, which recognizes Child Abuse and Prevention Month, we'll talk to these two women who are on the front lines offering services here in Fond du Lac County to children that are involved in child protection cases. So we're going to learn more about their roles in protecting children here locally, as well as what the county provides in terms of resources for parents who may be struggling to provide for the needs of their children, as well as insights into what you all can do as everyday citizens to help in the fight against child abuse and neglect. I should note here that the content within this filming today may be a trigger. So if you think that you may be triggered as a former abuse survivor, please take the necessary means to proceed with caution. So with that, big welcome to everyone today. We will just jump right in here. Erika, I often like to set things up with our audience to just give them an idea of the magnitude of the issue of child abuse and neglect here in Fond du Lac County. Can you give us an idea of roughly how many children are on Child in Need of Protective Services, also known as CHIPS orders, annually in Fond du Lac County? And how many social workers are assisting those families, as in, caseloads per worker, and how many children are placed in foster care or remain in home care and are monitored by CPS. So just an overview of what the numbers look like.
Yeah, of course. So I broke it down a little bit into sort of our front end work and our back end work. K&I supervise initial assessment, which is at the very beginning of the child protection process. We receive all of the calls of alleged child abuse for the county, and then we're responsible for doing the initial assessment, which is a 60-day process that I think we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then based on, what happens during that time and decisions that are made related to safety, those cases can be then passed on for ongoing services to one of our 3 ongoing teams. So as far as social workers and initial assessment, there are 11 social workers between Kay and myself. And then for our ongoing teams, there's 18 social workers between those 3 teams. So that would be a total of, well, my math isn't great, but 30 some social workers performing or carrying caseloads, involving children and families who are in need of our intervention. When we talk about caseload sizes, I'm going to refer to some of our numbers from 2020. In 2020, we had 1,304 calls. So that many people calling to say, hey, I'm concerned about this family, I'm concerned about this child, and alerting us to whatever that information is. Of all of those calls, there were 411 that we actually were screened in for further assessment, which I had referred to earlier as those initial assessments that we complete. And then to give you an idea of the number of open cases that are open for ongoing services, whether that be, children have been removed from the home and families are working on reunification, perhaps there's an in-home plan, and the ongoing worker is working to ameliorate maybe some of the family dynamics that are causing some problems. There were 130 open cases in 2020. And so just because we get involved on the front end and we do that assessment, all of those, or the majority of those cases, I would say, don't result in, ongoing intervention or court intervention from our department. As far as caseload sizes go, it obviously ebbs and flows depending on a lot of different factors that are taking place in our community. At the onset of COVID, we saw a sharp decline in calls, which was very concerning to us. Kay and I actually went on the radio and just sort of had a plea out to our community, like our families, our children aren't having as many contacts with mandated reporters. And so we were really concerned that we were going to be missing or not hearing about potentially concerning safety concerns or situations involving children. That lull didn't last extremely long. And things started to pick up, and I think we were back to business as usual. With that being said, our on the front end, an initial assessment, our case numbers are ranging from, let's see, on the low end, I would say 8, and then the high end 13. So really averaging about a caseload of 10 cases per worker. And then with ongoing, they measure their caseloads a little bit different. And the average number of children per each caseload is about 20 to 25 kids. And so that kind of gives you a picture, I think, of the quantity of families and children that we're serving and getting involved with. I will say, you had asked about numbers in out-of-home care. I don't have the exact numbers handy right now, but what I can tell you is that we are over 50% of kids who are placed in out-of-home care are placed with relatives or like kin. And as a department, we continue to, I would say, aggressively pursue that as our goal, to not only keep kids in their homes whenever possible when safety concerns are identified, but in the event they are having to be removed, we're working as hardly as we can to locate, and really have beefed up our efforts to locate relatives for children, as well as people that are just known to them, rather than having to put them in foster care or what we call stranger care, because it's even though it's necessary, it can be another kind of traumatic experience for kids.
Yeah, Erika, thank you. As a former teacher and principal, I took the job of being a mandatory reporter very seriously. Obviously, it's unfortunate anytime you have to be a mandatory reporter, because that means that something is happening to a child that, that shouldn't be, that's causing possible trauma or harm. But can you just talk to us a little bit about the role of a mandatory reporter, Kay, and who else beside a teacher or principal maybe would find themselves in a position to be a mandatory reporter? Because as you said, when those really important people are taken out of that loop, sometimes things can go unnoticed, or kids that need help don't get it. So can you just talk us through that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So, mandatory reporters would be those, think of any of those people that are having contact with kids on a regular basis in any sort of a professional setting. That would be the teachers, the principals, the aides, the doctors, the nurses, any medical personnel, the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, all of those different facilities and places that support children on a daily basis. And so, as Erika mentioned, during COVID, during the pandemic, everything was really virtually shut down. So, all of the children that were having regular contact with all of those mandatory reporters were no longer doing so. Even in the cases of pediatricians, weren't having contact with those children. They were either talking to parents via phone or maybe virtually, but really weren't having that face-to-face contact in order to really have understanding of what that child's experience or environment may be that might be placing them at risk at their home or in the community. And so they would be the people that would be mandated to report to our agency. And so when we weren't receiving those reports, we were very concerned, because it didn't mean that bad things weren't happening to children. It just meant that we weren't getting the necessary reports to be able to make contact with those families, because we didn't know what was happening. And so those are some of the groups that we were hoping to outreach to. And then there's another group of non-mandated reporters. And of course, that's going to be your neighbors, your family members, and your citizens that have any knowledge of situations for children and families that might either present risk to children or that there is specific information outlining abuse or neglect situations. And we take all of those calls, and you don't have to actually witness the abuse or the neglect incident. And many people feel like they're not able to call because they haven't specifically witnessed something. But they can have like a reasonable person standard, like like if you believe and it's out of good faith in your heart that you believe that there is some risk situation for a child, we always would prefer that people err on the side of caution to give us a call and inform us of what that situation might be for that child. And then we would take the necessary steps through our process in order to make a determination about whether or not we need to get involved. Again, our primary goal is to assess safety and to offer services to that family to keep that family intact, albeit safely. And that's the key word, is safety for children.
Yeah, Kate, and I just want to add one more follow-up on that. I appreciate all of your knowledge and walking us through that. And I know Kyle's a coach. So, coaches are another group of people that are really instrumental in making those reports. And I love that you brought up too, that sometimes you feel like maybe you don't have enough to go on other than I notice these little things and my hunch says that something's not right. I would always remind people too, you never know when you maybe are the piece of the puzzle that's been missing. Whatever you witnessed, whatever, your bit of information is, you might be the third call that's finally the push to really, allow your agency to step in and help kids. So just thanks for walking us through that process.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Erin, for that too. I didn't think about that part as a coach as well. Okay, you hit on some really key points. I didn't realize you had so many different avenues or reporters that can help protect the kids, protect the youth. When you think about abuse and stuff like that, I didn't realize how broad view of abuse is. It can go many different ways. My wife is a teacher. She doesn't tell me much, but I've definitely known a couple of situations at their time as a teacher where she recorded something or reported something because she felt that, a kid was being harmed in a negative way. So I've definitely seen my wife and seen some of those faces, and they're not very pretty ones. But I know she's doing something to help protect the youth so they can grow up and continue to protect other youth as things go on. So when you kind of think about that part in an instance, right, there's a broad view of abuse. It's not just like I got whoops on my back or whoops on my legs. There's other forms of abuse that you can go to. Can you guys help us better understand neglect and role of social workers in cases like that and determine what, how you deem for a parent to be unfit to care for like a child or their child?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. There's several categories of child maltreatment, one of which is physical abuse. Another one is neglect, and the handprint to the face or the significant bruising. Those are probably the things we see most infrequently. The larger majority of, or probably the biggest pot of cases that we see are the cases of neglect. And with that being said, those are often the hardest to prove because it's not obvious, like an injury is something you can see and you can tell how bad it is compared to, other types of injuries. But neglect is, you're often considering many different factors and, thinking critically about what does that mean for this child on a day-to-day basis? And how is this different than just a choice in lifestyle? Like perhaps you and I wouldn't live in a home like this, or we wouldn't, engage with our children in this way. But that doesn't mean it rises to that level of a safety threat. And, we really rely heavily on our safety criteria, which is, it tells us these are the elements that have to be present. These are the things that you have to consider when you're you're seeing a concern that's in a family system, and does it meet all of these different elements for us to intervene, or for it to really rise to that level for court intervention, or in home planning. One of the big things we talk to people about, and it's not like you don't have to know that to report, but we also want people to be thinking critically about, what is it that they're seeing, hearing, smelling, whatever it might be, that is causing them to be concerned. And then really thinking about, do I believe that this could result in severe harm to this child? And if so, that would be a reason to pick up the phone and give us a call. You asked about when do we determine, if a parent really doesn't have the capacity to meet their children's needs. It's definitely, there's many things that we consider, and we have up to 60 days to gather as much information as possible to arrive at that decision. And prior to saying, they can't do it, or they don't maybe have the necessary enhanced protective capacities that we would like to see, we're really going to try to partner with the parent or parents to, implement services, try to put in different formal and informal supports, in those areas that we see are lacking, again, so that we can avoid a formal intervention from our department, and address whatever issues those might be in a more informal way. So I think neglect is definitely like what we see most often. And I think Erin brought up a good point that we have a lot more information at our fingertips. There's many systems that we access when a report comes into us, and we're looking at, their CCAP history. We're looking at all of their CPS history. We have a database that we look at. And so we're able to put a lot of pieces of a puzzle together that, one individual may not know or understand, but it could be the difference between us intervening in a unsafe situation for a child or not.
So Erika, just real quick, I just got to ask, what are some of those like key things that I should look for, any of us should look for? Because I am a coach. When you think about neglect, because some kids can hide it and some kids can't. So like, do you have any like key things to look for to help like identify that says, okay, you should really be looking for this?
That's a good question. I think it's hard to say, because on one hand, some of those things that might indicate a bigger problem at home are also, I don't know, just things that might be happening with that child that don't necessarily mean something bigger is happening, right? So if the child's often unkempt, they're not changing clothes, they're having a strong odor, they aren't dressing properly for the season, they're very hungry, maybe they're often tired, parents are late to pick them up, or they're just completely forgetting, where you're having to reach out to other people, to try to come and get the child from practice. Those are definitely things that could, indicate that something bigger or greater is happening, but it's also not causal, right? Like, we can't say, well, if we check these boxes, that must mean this child is being neglected. We would have to have some, greater understanding of that family system for us to probably take any action. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's funny.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up being late to picking kids up from practice. I mean, who hasn't been there, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm running late to grab the kids from practice. But so, that makes a good point. Like a singular instance is not obviously enough for you all to get involved. But, one of the things in the work that I've done surrounding child abuse and neglect is, it seems that across the board, neglect is the largest issue that Child Protective Services deal with, no matter where you are, no matter what county, no matter what state, neglect is the issue. And so much of that is linked back to the parents, whether they experience child abuse or domestic violence within their own homes growing up, and now have not address their own personal traumas and have learned how to quote unquote discipline their children in a way that is not healthy. So that's one thing, but also they're turning a lot of times to alcohol and drugs as a way to cope. And then mental health issues, unresolved mental health issues. So there's all these layers associated whenever you're getting involved in a case of child abuse and neglect that I think just the general public wants to villainize the parents, right? Because, it's horrifying to think of anyone harming a child. But what is more bothersome to me is the lack of recognition that we have as a society to realize that most people aren't evil. Most people want to do the best that they can, and they have their own personal issues that, for whatever reason, never got addressed. So, that's one of the things that in my work, my professional life, I've tried to dedicate toward the prevention aspect of things, because I believe that is the only way we are going to solve all of these social issues, is if we can get to the heart of things earlier, and children can get the resources they need as early as possible. So that can set forth the healing, and then they don't go on to repeat those cycles. So, with that idea, Kay, perhaps you could walk us through kind of the steps in the timeline of a typical case. And obviously no case is typical. I realize that everyone is very unique in its own situation, but from the time a complaint comes in, what are the steps that occur and what sort of mandated timelines? There's federal timelines I know that you are required to meet in terms of, the 60 days has been mentioned, where you need to complete that initial investigation within that time, but there's other timelines along the way. And I'd just love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd love to. So, a couple of timelines to note is whenever a report is made to our agency, we have 24 hours in order to review that report, put together all that other information that we might have to kind of supplement that in order to make a decision. And so, that's a very important timeline in order to decide, is this a family that we need to attempt an intervention with because a child may or may not be safe in that home? Or is this a situation that it does not meet our criteria and we're going to do what we call screen out, or decide we're not going to intervene in this family because it doesn't meet our guidelines? Because we don't want to be involved in families that we don't have a business being involved in. So if Maria, you failed to pick up your kids timely, we don't need to come knocking on your door for that single isolated incident. But somebody could report something like that, but that wouldn't meet our criteria for intervening in your family, right? We have to have something much more egregious that would result in severe harm to those children. And so that's our very first timeline. And after that, if we decide that in fact it is a situation where we need to screen that report in, then we have to start making decisions about how quickly do we need to have face-to-face contact with that family based on the urgency of what's presenting itself to us. And so the most urgent time frame we have is the same day time frame to have face-to-face contact, preferably with that alleged victim child in the home. And then the next time frame we would have is between 24 to 48 hours. That's for also a fairly urgent safety situation, but it will give us a bit more time to be a little more planful about how we're going to intervene with that family and where we're going to intervene. And then our last option would be a 5-day response time. And that would be indicative of those situations where there is a lot of risk being reported for a particular child or children in that family, but it's not jumping off of the page saying that there's something urgently unsafe about that situation. And then we have two different tracks in which we can determine how we're going to intervene with that family. We have a traditional response, which is more of a investigative, if you will, type method, where we can intervene with that family by going to school and interviewing the child first, if the child is school age, or to a daycare setting. The other way is alternative response approach, which would mean that we would try to call the parents first, and we would have dialogue with them as our first contact to let them know we did receive a report and that we need to do certain steps in interviewing all the people in the household, including the parents and the children, and really partner with them around how should that happen. And so we're really doing the exact same steps in both different kinds of tracks. But the alternative response is really more partnering with the parent. Now, having said that, there are certain rule outs for alternative response, as you could imagine, because a lot of people, it kind of raises an eyebrow. Well, you wouldn't want to tell parents that you're coming, right? Well, a lot of times we do want to tell them because if it's a case of neglect, sometimes we want to talk with them at first and say, there's a problem. We want to talk to you about that problem because ultimately they're going to be a part of solving that problem and coming up with solutions, right? As a parent, you would understand if there was a problem with your family, you'd probably want to be the first one to be called, not the last. But the rule outs for alternative response would primarily be those cases of alleged sexual assault, particularly when it's within the home environment. And as you can imagine, if that were the case, we wouldn't go first to anybody who is an alleged perpetrator of sexual assault in the home for obvious reasons. So that would be a rule out for that. The next time frames would be around that 60-day time frame that you mentioned. We have 60 days to do our total assessment. That means having face-to-face contact with not only all of the family members, but everyone that would reside within the household, because our families today are not just mom, dad, kids. Our family definition is much broader than that. It could include roommates. It could include two families cohabitating together. It could mean people coming and going from that household structure at any given time, especially during times such as a pandemic when finances are challenging. We have a lot of different families being transient, moving from place to place. So it can be a bit challenging, but we have to have face-to-face contact with everyone within that household. And that all has to happen within the 60 days. We also have to have contact with collateral contacts, anybody who has information about how the family is doing, how they're functioning well, how they might be struggling, all within that 60-day time period. We have to have a determination during that 60 days if whether a child is safe or unsafe. If a child is unsafe, then we have to make determinations about we're either going to work with that family voluntarily to continue providing safety services so that we're assured that the children are going to be safe, or in some cases, we do refer to court and we can work with the family informally with their agreement for 6 months, which would be a step before we would get court involved with our juvenile intake department. The next step would be that it would be formally referred to court. And that decision would be made at the 60-day mark as well. And then it would be referred on to our ongoing services teams. And then they would work with the family throughout the court process until they would reach disposition, indicating that the child or children are alleged to have been in need of protection and services, and actually reaching a disposition that they are children in need of protection and services.
Yeah.
And then I'm sorry. And then lastly, I would just say if children are placed in out-of-home care, that ongoing team then works with the family throughout the process to work with parents or caregivers to work towards reunification whenever possible. And if reunification cannot be met, then they want to work towards permanency with another relative, guardian, or in some unfortunate circumstances, a termination of parental rights.
Yeah, Kate, sorry, I apologize for interrupting before.
Mhm.
I appreciate you walking us through the process. And one thing that's obvious is that when we report, we typically think about a really quick solution, right? Because we just want to, in our mind, to know that a child is done being harmed, but clearly that's not the way this works. And with good reason, because the goal of your agency really is to keep families together, right? So early intervention and making a report as a bystander, somebody that sees something, can actually really help a family stay together, right? And maybe have the tools necessary in order to remedy whatever's going on in the home. Hopefully it's something that can be fixed. So as part of Fond du Lac Says No More, one of the programs that we have is Green Dot Bystander Intervention Training, which has a two-pronged approach. One is when we see something, we say something. And the other one is when we see something, we have some tools to jump in to hopefully prevent further harm from happening as a preventative measure. Erika, when you think about suggestions you have for people who might be concerned and find themselves in a reporting role, even though they're not a mandatory reporter, I'm guessing I already know your answer, but would you encourage people to still report, to jump in, even though they're not mandated to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. We often say we can't do this alone. It's not just the responsibility of the Department of Social Services to intervene for the safety and welfare of children, and as well as the preservation of family units. It's a really, really big job, and we rely on our community partners. We rely on family members, friends, anybody who thinks there might be a problem. And it's never wrong to pick up the phone and call us. We would rather have the burden and responsibility on us to decide, is this something we get involved in or not, versus a person like being bothered and, oh, what should I do? Maybe I should call. What if I don't? Going through this whole internal process, that can be our job and our responsibility. And I think it also goes back to what Maria was saying earlier about villainizing parents as well as villainizing our department, right? Child protection, we're the bad guys, we take kids away. And it's just astonishing to me how many opportunities here in Fond du Lac County that we have to try to reshape that stigma. And I think we're dedicated to doing that. And every county and every state's a little bit different, and so I can only speak for us, but we know that we can't make positive changes to a family situation if we don't go through the parents. And you're right, they've had a lot of varying experiences that result in them showing up the way they do today in their own family. And when we meet them face to face, and we do our best to meet them where they're at, no matter what they've done, even in some of the worst situations, we're still trying to say, hey, not trying to say, you are a human being. We're going to show you respect, and we're going to partner with you through this, intervention. And, at all times really working to maintain that family unit. It's not one of the worst things we have to do as a worker or as a supervisor is make that call that no matter what we've tried so far, it's not going to work for us to safely keep that child or those children in a home. It's a terrible decision to have to make. And it's always a very last resort. And I just, I want this community to know that. I want the families that we work with to know and understand that. And that, we can work together, and we can all make a difference. Not just, in the month of April when it's Child Abuse Prevention Month, but all of the time. We need to be on the lookout because, these kids can't advocate for themselves. And they need all of us to be their voice and to show up for them, even if it's uncomfortable or scary. Our access workers who receive those calls, do I think a really nice job of being supportive of callers, explaining the process to them, answering questions, reassuring them of reporter confidentiality, all of those things that a caller might have who isn't familiar with this process. You know, some of those worries and concerns they might have if they're calling our department to make a report.
Okay, obviously the timing of the interview is to coincide with April as a Child Abuse and Prevention Month. Can you just give us an idea of any activities that might be going on and that people might get involved in just from an awareness raising standpoint? What types of things are going on here in Fond du Lac County?
So we have in our department put up a display to make note of the awareness month, and we have some calendars available for families of free and fun things that they can do with their children. There's no cost associated with that. Um, and I would just really urge people in the community to get involved during this month. Like the awareness month is to do just that, bring awareness to what is happening in your community with children and what can we do to prevent and how do we prevent, we get involved. And you can do that, like there's a whole spectrum of ways that you can get involved. You can get involved by volunteering at your Boys and Girls Club. You can become a big brother, big sister. Um, you can be a coach. You can be a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout leader. You can volunteer in your child's classroom. You can do all the way to coming or calling our department to find out about how to do foster care. Even though foster care is a last resort, it is still a highly necessary function that we do have, because there are situations when children don't have any family or like kin that is readily available to take placement. It doesn't mean that they don't want to be involved. It just means that their circumstances are such they can't do that. And so if you're interested in just learning more about it, doesn't mean you have to commit to it. You can just call our main number at 929-3400 and just ask for the foster care unit, and they'll just give you some information and walk you through that. So any way that you can become involved in your community, in the Fond du Lac community, or whatever community you're in, where you interface with children for supportive reasons, because the old saying really is true. It just takes one adult to believe in a child to make an impact. And we see it be true time and time again. And I'll go back to something that Kyle mentioned about, when you're a coach, what do you look for? It's not so much about what you need to look for. It's about the relationship you build with any child. It's through that relationship that the child becomes safe enough to share with you that they might not feel safe at home, that they might be hungry, that their parent might be under the influence, that they might have been sexually abused. That is the thing. The relationship is the thing with that adult or caregiver or person that's going to help them to get safe.
I
So
was
get
just going to
involved.
say, I think it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking the exact same thing, is that I was going to circle back to what Kyle said, in that if you're noticing some of those things, that might be your cue to say, hey, Johnny, like, how are things going with you? Or you want to go grab some ice cream after practice, or just like, and if people, you don't have to be a coach to do that, right? It could be one of your kids' friends that you've maybe noticed some things about, and prior till now, you've had some reservations about maybe taking the next step. But I think now would be a really good time to just, if you've been have some nagging about maybe a child having some problem or concern, to just take the extra step to start to engage in some conversation with them, because like Kate mentioned, that's how you're gonna discover what might be happening with them on a bigger, deeper level.
And the same also holds true for parents. So where there's a child who's struggling, it means there's a parent who's struggling. I think Maria said it best, a parent doesn't wake up in the morning and say, geez, today's the day I'm not going to meet my child's needs. No parent says that ever. And so if you notice that there's a parent or parents anywhere that may be struggling, and there's some way that you can do something to make their burden a little bit lighter. You don't have to ask a lot of questions. You might just say, hey, like, are you short on food resources? I'll drop off a bag of groceries, no questions asked. Or any way that you notice something and you can just make a small tiny difference because your life is going well for you right now. That's what community is. And I think that's what Fond du Lac County community is all about.
Well, that's a great way to wrap this up. I think it is about doing something. It's as simple as that. So often we get involved in our own lives and wrapped up in that. But if we could just take 1 second to recognize other people that need our help or just need a kind word, I think that's the thing, the starting point for everyone. Pay attention and make an overture. So thank you, Erika and Kay, for coming today. Erin and Kyle, thanks again for joining in. So ends this edition of Project Table Talk. It's a part of the Fond du Lac Says No More initiative. We've been working on this project since 2018. If you need to know more, FDLsaysnomore.org is where you can find that information and all of the things that we're doing at the Women's Fund associated with our mission to facilitate bold change for women and girls throughout Fond du Lac County. I appreciate all of you coming and joining with us today. Thank you, and we will see you again.